How do you teach your family to respect you? I was in my home studio when my parents called me. There's not enough seats for everyone at the wedding. Cuts had to be made, and you were one of them. You understand, right? I took a deep breath. But I already wrote a speech, and my flight was $700. It's non-refundable. Martin, my dad's voice cut through like a knife. This is a formal event. People eat with multiple forks. Your sister's CEO friends will be there, and we know crowds make you nervous. Dad, I'm 29. Remember to eat something before calling us back. You get cranky when you're hungry. Beep. He hung up. A cold dread filled my chest. I dropped out of film school 8 years ago, and they still couldn't even pretend I mattered. An hour later, I got another call. It was their wedding planner. Mr. Martin, this is Alyssa from Wedding Love. I'm calling about your sister's wedding next month. Your family contacted us with some changes. My stomach dropped. What kind of changes? They've removed you from the guest list entirely, but they also specifically requested that we keep your $50,000 deposit for the videography package. Your mother said the family had already allocated those funds to other wedding expenses. The videography package I'd insisted on paying for because I wanted to give my sister something special. My hands were shaking now, but not from sadness. Alyssa, I need to ask you something. What's the name of your wedding venue? The Skyline Manor downtown. Why? And who owns that property? I heard papers shuffling. It's listed under Camera Holdings, LLC. My voice was steady now. What about the catering company? Golden Plate Catering, but I don't see why. She paused. Wait, that's also Camera Holdings. Keep going. The florist, the DJ, the limos. With each name, I heard her breathing get faster. Mr. Martin, are you telling me I own every single vendor for this wedding? Every single one. The words felt strange coming out. 8 years of letting them think I was struggling while I quietly built $1 million empire shooting commercials. 8 years of when you get a real job, and we remember what happened at your prom, as if I was still the awkward teenager who stepped on Sarah's friend's dress. Cancel everything, I said quietly. Every contract, every reservation. Send my parents an itemized bill showing exactly what their actual budget needs to cover. They can keep my videography deposit since they already spent it. But sir, the wedding is in 3 weeks. There are 180 guests. Then they better start making calls. After I hung up, I sat in my studio surrounded by equipment they thought was just an expensive hobby. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Martin, we've made our decision. The invitation had a dress code anyway. We know how you struggle with those. When you get a real job, you'll understand these decisions. Don't contact your sister. I typed back, understood. Good luck with the vendors. I was pulling footage from a drive when my phone exploded with calls. Mom, Dad, my sister, numbers I didn't recognize. I let them ring until Dad called for the 8th time. Martin! All the cockiness had left his voice. He was panicked, almost screaming. Every vendor just canceled. The venue, the caterer, everyone. There's been some terrible mistake. No mistake, Dad. They all work for me. The silence was so complete I could hear his breathing. That's impossible. You make little videos and you can barely afford. I make commercials for Nike, Dad. And every single vendor you hired reports to me. We can work this out. You're still family. Family? I laughed. An hour ago you were worried I couldn't handle multiple forks. Martin, don't be sensitive. You know we only want what's best. No, Dad. What you want is a wedding you can't afford. My phone rang again. This time it was my sister. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Martin? Her voice was tiny, broken. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. What's happening? Mom and Dad are screaming. The venue called me directly. They said everything's canceled? My anger crumbled a little. Did you know they uninvited me? What? No. Mom said you had a big shoot that weekend and couldn't make it. Her sobs got louder. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I'd done. They kept my $50,000 deposit, too. Said they already spent it. $50,000. Martin, oh my God, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. She was hiccuping now, that same way she used to when we were kids. Can you put it back? The vendors? My voice cracked. I'm sorry. But they need to learn they can't treat me like this anymore. 8 years of being treated like I'm a child who can't handle use forks. But it's my wedding, she whispered. I had to choose between teaching my parents a lesson and the biggest day of my sister's life. I sat there staring at my phone screen, Esmeralda's sobs still playing in my head like a loop I couldn't shut off. My finger hovered over Bianca's contact, and I knew whatever I did next would change everything with my family forever. The anger was still burning in my chest, hot and sharp, but mixed with it now was the sound of my little sister crying over a mess she didn't create. I pressed the call button before I could change my mind. Bianca answered on the first ring, probably expecting more chaos. I told her to hold off on sending the cancellation notices for 24 hours to freeze everything while I figured out what I wanted to do. She sounded relieved, said she'd pause all the vendor communications, but warned me that some of them were already asking questions about what was happening. I promised her I'd give a final answer by tomorrow morning, and hung up feeling like someone had dropped a boulder on my chest. The next hour I spent pacing around my studio, walking back and forth between the equipment racks and editing stations. My phone kept buzzing on the desk with incoming calls. I glanced at it each time and saw my dad's name, over and over. 7 more attempts in 40 minutes. I let every single one go to voicemail because I needed space to think without his panic or manipulation messing with my head. The studio felt different now, looking at all the cameras and lights and gear my parents dismissed as expensive toys. This equipment had paid for itself 100 times over, had built a business they didn't even know existed, and here I was using it as leverage in a family war I never wanted to fight. Around midnight, I finally made myself listen to my dad's voicemails. I sat at my desk with the phone on speaker and played them in order. The first one was angry, his voice tight and accusing, saying I was being ridiculous and childish. The second one was confused, asking how this could have happened, demanding an explanation. By the fourth voicemail, his tone had shifted to desperate, almost frantic, talking about how much money they'd already spent and how impossible it would be to find new vendors this close to the wedding. The last one, the 7th attempt, had him saying we could talk about this like adults, that we were family and family works things out. The irony hit me hard, coming from someone who'd treated me like a child that same morning, who'd hung up on me when I tried to explain about my flight. What got me most was that not once in any of those messages did he actually apologize or say they'd done something wrong. It was all about the problem I'd created, the mess I was making, never about what they'd done to cause this. I deleted all the voicemails and called Xavier even though it was late. He answered on the second ring, which didn't surprise me since he was used to my weird hours when we were finishing projects. I explained the whole situation to him, every detail from the uninvitation to the deposit to the fact that I'd just threatened to destroy my own sister's wedding. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long pause before he said, we needed to think about the business implications beyond just the family stuff. Xavier pointed out that if word got out that Camera Holdings pulled contracts for personal reasons, it could seriously damage our reputation with other clients. He wasn't wrong, and I knew it. We'd spent years building the business on being reliable and professional, and this looked like neither of those things. We agreed to meet first thing in the morning at the office to discuss options that would protect both my boundaries and the company's reputation. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning and woke up at 7 to my phone buzzing like crazy on the nightstand. 17 new text messages, most of them from my mom. I scrolled through them while still in bed, watching her strategy shift from message to message. The early ones were angry, calling me selfish and dramatic. The middle ones tried guilt, talking about how I was destroying my sister's happiness and ruining what should be the best day of her life. The last few went deeper, saying this wasn't who they raised me to be, that family doesn't treat each other this way, that I was being cruel over hurt feelings. The irony of that last part almost made me laugh out loud. They didn't raise me to be successful either, but here I was running $1 million company they knew nothing about. At the office that morning, Xavier and I met with Brendan in the conference room. Our business attorney spread all the vendor contracts across the table and went through them one by one. He confirmed that legally I had every right to cancel everything since Camera Holdings owned the contracts, but he also pointed out something I hadn't considered. Some of the contracts had penalty clauses that would cost my company actual money if we backed out. We were looking at potentially $15,000 in fees and lost deposits that Camera Holdings would have to eat, completely separate from the $50,000 my parents had already spent. Brendan also warned me about the optics of letting a family fight bleed into business operations. He said if I decided to put the vendors back, we needed clear paperwork separating this situation from normal business practices. We spent an hour discussing how to create a formal policy about conflicts of interest and contracts with family members to prevent this kind of disaster in the future. My phone rang again while we were still in the meeting, and this time the screen showed Constantine's name. I actually liked Esmeralda's fiancé, had always found him easy to talk to, and he'd never bought into my parents' story about my career being a joke. I stepped out of the conference room to take the call. He asked if we could meet for coffee that afternoon, just the two of us, to talk through what was happening. His voice was calm and steady, not angry or accusing, just reasonable. I told him yes, and we set a time for 3 o'clock at the coffee shop near my studio. Constantine showed up exactly on time, looking tired but calm. We found a quiet corner table, and I explained everything about the mediation idea that Brendan had suggested. He listened without interrupting, and said he thought it was smart, that Esmeralda needed this kind of structured conversation too. He promised to talk to her that evening and get back to me. I drove back to my studio and opened my laptop to draft the email proposing mediation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a solid minute before I started typing. I kept it simple and direct, explaining that Brendan had recommended a professional mediator named Shirley to help us have a productive conversation about what happened and how to move forward. I wrote that I wanted to find a path that worked for everyone, but that we needed clear communication and mutual respect to get there. I copied Esmeralda, my parents, Xavier, and Brendan so everyone had the same information. My finger shook slightly when I hit send. Constantine's response came through within 5 minutes. He wrote that both he and Esmeralda were willing to participate and appreciated me taking this step. Esmeralda sent a separate message 10 minutes later, saying she was relieved and hopeful that this could help. Then I waited. My parents' response took 6 hours, arriving just after 9 that night. My mom had written it, and I could feel her reluctance in every word. She said this seemed excessive for a family disagreement, but that they would attend if it meant resolving this situation. The fact that she still called it a disagreement, rather than acknowledging what they actually did, told me exactly how much work this would take. I forwarded all the responses to Brendan and asked him to reach out to Shirley to set up the sessions. He got back to me the next morning saying Shirley wanted to meet with me individually first, before the family session. We scheduled it for 2 days out at her office downtown. The morning of my individual session with Shirley, I got stuck in traffic and arrived 10 minutes late. Her office was in a modern building with glass walls and minimalist furniture that somehow felt both professional and comfortable. Shirley herself was probably in her 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through whatever front you were putting up. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to a chair across from her desk. She started by explaining her process and asking me what I hoped to get out of mediation. I gave her the surface answer about wanting my parents to see me as an adult and respect my career choices. She nodded and made a note, then looked up at me with those sharp eyes and asked if I actually wanted a relationship with my parents, or if I was just looking for vindication. The question hit me harder than I expected. I sat there for a moment, really thinking about it, and told her honestly that I didn't know. I explained that I wanted them to see me as capable and successful, to acknowledge that they hurt me, but I wasn't sure if they were capable of that kind of change. I told her about 8 years of dismissive comments and being treated like I couldn't handle basic adult situations. She asked specific questions about my business, about the prom incident they kept bringing up, about my relationship with Esmeralda. By the end of the hour, I felt like she understood the full scope of the problem. She said she'd meet with my parents next, then Esmeralda and Constantine together, before we all came together for the first group session. The first mediation session was scheduled for 4 days after I'd canceled the vendors, which left only 12 days until the wedding date. I arrived at Shirley's office 15 minutes early and sat in my car trying to calm my nerves. Esmeralda and Constantine pulled in a few minutes later, and we walked in together. My parents were already there, sitting in the waiting area with their arms crossed and identical expressions of discomfort. Shirley led us into a larger conference room with a round table that forced us all to face each other. My parents sat on one side. I sat directly across from them, and Esmeralda and Constantine took seats slightly to the side. Shirley positioned herself at the head of the table and started by laying out ground rules about respectful communication and taking turns speaking without interruption. She emphasized that we were here to discuss specific behaviors and their impacts, not to attack each other's characters. My dad barely let her finish before jumping in. He said this whole situation had been blown out of proportion and that they'd made a practical decision about seating that I took too personally. Shirley held up her hand and stopped him mid-sentence. She asked him to focus on facts rather than interpretations of my reaction. When she pressed him to explain the actual facts of what they decided and why, he shifted in his seat and looked at my mom. Then he admitted they uninvited me because they were worried I'd be uncomfortable around Esmeralda's professional connections and that it would reflect poorly on the family. The words hung in the air between us. I felt my chest tighten but forced myself to stay calm and ask him directly what he meant by reflect poorly. He stumbled through an explanation about formal events and social expectations and knowing the right things to say. My mom jumped in to help him, saying they were trying to protect me from an uncomfortable situation like the prom incident years ago. Shirley asked what the prom incident was, and I had to explain that when I was 17, I accidentally stepped on my date's friend's dress and tore it. My parents had apparently been holding that against me for over a decade, as proof that I couldn't handle formal social situations. Esmeralda's voice cut through the tension, shaking but firm. She said she had no idea they were still hung up on prom and that using a teenage accident to justify uninviting me from her wedding was absurd. Constantine backed her up immediately, pointing out that his family had never expressed any concerns about me attending and that my parents seemed to be projecting their own worries onto the situation. Shirley redirected the conversation to the $50,000 deposit, and I watched my mom's face go pale. She tried to explain that they thought of it as family money contributing to a family event and that they'd already committed those funds to the venue upgrade and catering additions. I kept my voice steady as I pointed out that it was my money from my business, given as a specific gift for videography, and they had no right to redirect it without asking me first. My dad got defensive and said that if I was really successful, I wouldn't miss $50,000. Shirley asked him how he'd feel if someone took $50,000 from him without permission, regardless of his financial situation. He didn't have a good answer for that. The silence stretched out uncomfortably but felt necessary. We spent the next hour going through each specific point of hurt and misunderstanding. Shirley kept us focused on concrete behaviors rather than character attacks. My parents slowly started to acknowledge some of what they did wrong, though they kept trying to justify everything with their intentions. Shirley pointed out that impact matters more than intent, and that their actions hurt me regardless of what they meant to accomplish. By the time we reached the end of the session, we hadn't resolved anything concrete, but Shirley had gotten my parents to agree to a second session and to seriously consider my conditions. She gave them homework to write down specifically what they did that was hurtful and what they could have done differently. She gave me homework too, asking me to write down what a realistic path forward looked like and what I was willing to compromise on. We all filed out of her office without speaking to each other, and I sat in my car for 10 minutes before starting the engine. I drove home on autopilot, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Back at my studio, I pulled out the homework assignment Shirley had given me and stared at the blank page for a solid 20 minutes. The question was simple, but I kept circling around it. What did I actually want from all this? I started writing, and the words came faster than I expected. I wanted them to see me as someone who mattered, not as the awkward kid from prom who couldn't handle fancy dinners. The wedding itself felt almost beside the point now. It was about whether my parents could look at me and see an actual adult with a real career and a legitimate life. I wrote down my conditions in bullet points. A genuine apology that acknowledged what they did wrong. A repayment plan for the $50,000 with actual numbers and dates. A commitment to treating me with basic respect going forward, which meant no more comments about my career or my ability to function at formal events. I looked at the list and felt something settle in my chest. These weren't unreasonable demands. They were just boundaries that any adult deserved. The next day, I revised the list 3 times, making sure every point was clear and specific. I didn't want vague promises about doing better. I wanted concrete actions they could actually follow through on. By the time the second mediation session rolled around, I'd printed out my homework and highlighted the key sections. Shirley's office felt different this time. My parents arrived exactly on time, both carrying folders that looked suspiciously prepared. We took the same seats as before, the same tension crackling in the air, but something had shifted slightly. Shirley started by asking my parents to share what they'd written. My mom went first, pulling out several handwritten pages that surprised me. She'd actually put real thought into this. She listed out the uninvitation without trying to soften it or make excuses. She wrote about taking the deposit without asking permission and how that was wrong regardless of their intentions. She included the dismissive comments about my career, the comparisons to Esmeralda's CEO friends, the constant reminders about prom like I was still 17. Her voice shook a little as she read, and I could see her hands trembling on the pages. My dad's list came next, and it was noticeably shorter. He'd typed it on his phone and the formatting was messy, but he did acknowledge that they should have talked to me before making decisions about the wedding. He admitted they'd made assumptions about my business without bothering to ask questions. His delivery was more defensive than my mom's, lots of phrases like, in hindsight, and perhaps we could have. But at least he was saying something. Shirley let the silence sit for a moment after they finished reading. Then she asked them directly what they could have done differently in each situation. My mom answered first, her voice steadier now. She said they should have been honest about their concerns instead of making up excuses about big shoots and seating arrangements. She admitted they were worried about being judged by Esmeralda's professional circle and that they'd projected that anxiety onto me instead of dealing with it themselves. She talked about how they'd built up this image of the perfect family in their heads, and I didn't fit that image because I dropped out of film school. My dad added, after a long pause, that they should have asked about my business instead of assuming I was struggling. He said reluctantly that they'd been stuck seeing me as the awkward teenager from prom instead of the adult I'd become. He mentioned that they'd never really updated their mental picture of who I was. Shirley nodded and made notes, then asked them why they thought changing that mental picture had been so difficult. My mom's answer surprised me. She said they'd been embarrassed about me for so long that it became a habit, and habits are hard to break even when you know they're wrong. I read my homework next, my voice coming out calmer than I felt. I explained that I needed them to see my career as legitimate and stop making comments that undermined my success. I went through some of the major clients I'd worked with over the past few years. Nike campaigns that aired during primetime sports events, Apple product launches that millions of people saw, major ad agencies that paid 6 figures for my work. I watched their faces as I listed these names, and I could see the surprise register. They genuinely hadn't known. I also explained what the $50,000 had meant to me. It wasn't just money, though that was part of it. It was my way of showing Esmeralda that I cared about her day and wanted to give her something special. Having it taken without even a conversation felt like being erased from the family. Like my contribution didn't matter because I didn't matter. My voice cracked a little on that last part, but I kept going. I told them I'd spent 8 years building something real while they treated me like I was playing with expensive toys. I'd let them think I was struggling because I didn't want to deal with their judgment, but that was my mistake. I should have demanded respect instead of hiding my success. Esmeralda started crying before I finished reading. Not the quiet tears from last time, but actual sobs that shook her shoulders. Constantine handed her tissues and she tried to pull herself together, but the words came out broken anyway. She apologized for not standing up for me sooner. She said she'd been so focused on keeping the peace and managing our parents' expectations that she didn't realize how badly they were treating me. She admitted she'd heard the comments about my career over the years, but she dismissed them as typical parent stuff, not understanding how much they added up. Constantine put his arm around her and spoke directly to my parents. He said they wanted to make this right, and they were willing to scale back the wedding significantly if it meant I was included and respected. He mentioned that his own parents had been uncomfortable with the size and expense from the beginning. They'd rather have something smaller and more personal anyway. Esmeralda nodded against his shoulder and added that she'd never wanted a huge wedding in the first place. That had been our parents' vision, not hers. My parents looked like they'd been slapped. My mom's face went pale and my dad shifted in his seat uncomfortably. Shirley let the moment breathe before speaking. She pointed out gently that their concern about appearances seemed to be at the root of a lot of this conflict. The big wedding was about impressing people. Uninviting me was about not being embarrassed. Taking the deposit was about maintaining the image they wanted to project. She asked them directly whether their relationship with me was more important than impressing Esmeralda's CEO friends. My mom said yes immediately, her voice firm. My dad took longer to answer. He looked at me, then at Esmeralda, then back at Shirley. Finally, he said yes too, though his jaw was tight when he said it. Shirley made a note and asked what that meant in practical terms. What were they willing to change about the wedding to prioritize family relationships over appearances? The silence stretched out uncomfortably, and I could see my parents exchanging glances, having some kind of wordless conversation. We spent the rest of the session hammering out concrete solutions. Brendan joined us by phone, his voice coming through Shirley's speaker with that professional calm he always had. He walked through the repayment plan options, explaining different structures and timelines. We settled on $50,000 paid back over 2 years with a formal promissory note, 24 monthly payments of about $2,100 each. Brendan explained that this separated the gift aspect from the control aspect. They couldn't claim it was family money if they were legally required to pay it back. The promissory note would be a real contract with real consequences if they defaulted. My mom looked pained as Brendan went through the terms, but she agreed. My dad asked a few questions about interest rates and payment schedules, trying to negotiate better terms, but Brendan shut that down quickly. This wasn't a business deal where they could haggle. This was making right what they'd taken without permission. My dad signed off on it after Brendan explained the legal implications of defaulting on a promissory note between family members. For the wedding itself, we agreed that I'd be included as a full guest with no restrictions or special conditions. I wouldn't give a formal speech because honestly I didn't want that pressure, and neither did they. But I'd be treated like any other family member. Esmeralda spoke up and said she wanted me at the head table, right next to her and Constantine. My parents agreed without much pushback, which felt like real progress. My mom even suggested that I could sit between her and Esmeralda, so we could all be together. I appreciated the gesture even though I knew it was partly about maintaining that family image she cared so much about. But at least this time the image included me instead of erasing me. The bigger issue turned out to be the vendor situation. Xavier joined the meeting through Shirley's laptop, his face filling the screen with that focused expression he got when dealing with operational problems. He explained the challenges of reinstating everything with only 8 days until the wedding. Some vendors had already booked other events in those time slots after I'd canceled. The florist had taken a corporate event. The DJ had a Sweet 16 party. The backup photographer had a different wedding. We'd need to find replacements for at least 3 major vendors, possibly 4 depending on the limo company's availability. Xavier estimated we could restore about 70% of the original plan, but some compromises would be necessary. The timeline was brutal, and some things just wouldn't be possible to recreate. He pulled up a spreadsheet showing which vendors were available and which weren't, color-coded by priority level. My parents looked increasingly stressed as Xavier went through each item. Esmeralda surprised everyone by interrupting Xavier mid-explanation. She said she wanted to use this as an opportunity to scale back to the wedding she actually wanted. Her voice was stronger now, not shaky like before. She and Constantine had talked about this and they'd made a decision together. They wanted to cut the guest list from 180 to 80 people, close friends and family only, no business contacts or distant relatives they barely knew. They wanted to move from the massive Skyline Manor ballroom to the smaller garden venue on the same property. This would make the vendor situation much easier, because the garden venue had different availability and needed fewer services. It would also reduce costs significantly, which meant less financial stress on everyone. Constantine backed her up immediately, adding that his parents would be relieved by the change. They'd been worried about the expense and the formality from the beginning. A smaller, more intimate wedding felt right to both of them. Shirley turned to my parents and asked them directly if they could support Esmeralda's decision, even though it wasn't what they had planned. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. My mom's hands were folded tight in her lap, and she kept looking at my dad like she was waiting for him to speak first. Finally, she said yes, her voice quiet but clear. My dad took way longer to answer, and when he did, his face looked like he'd just eaten something rotten, but he nodded and agreed. Esmeralda let out a breath I didn't know she'd been holding, and Constantine squeezed her hand. Shirley made notes on her pad and said she'd work with Xavier to coordinate the changes. Then she ended the session by reminding everyone that this was progress, and we should acknowledge that. Over the next 3 days, my phone basically lived in my hand because Xavier was calling or texting every few hours with updates. He had his whole team working on reorganizing everything, and it was chaos, but the good kind, the kind where you can actually see things coming together. The garden venue at Skyline Manor was available, which was perfect because it was way more manageable than that massive ballroom. Xavier got the florist back first because they'd only taken a small corporate job that they could move around. The DJ agreed to honor the original contract after Xavier explained the situation and threw in a discount on future bookings. The photographer was trickier because she'd already committed to another wedding that same day, but Xavier found her backup, who turned out to have even better reviews. The caterer was the only total loss because they'd booked a huge anniversary party, but Xavier found this amazing replacement that Esmeralda actually liked better. When he showed her their menu, she got excited about the creative options they offered, stuff like fusion appetizers and custom cocktails that the original caterer never suggested. I met with Bianca 3 times that week to rebuild the videography package from scratch. She had all the original plans, but I told her I wanted to handle this shoot personally instead of sending one of my usual crews. She looked surprised and asked if I was sure because it was family, and that could get complicated. I said that's exactly why I needed to do it myself, because this wedding had stopped being just another event and become something way more important. Esmeralda came to one of those meetings and we spent the whole afternoon going through shot lists. She told me what moments mattered most to her, like the first look with Constantine and her mom helping with the veil and the toasts at dinner. She kept saying she couldn't believe I was doing this for her, and I kept telling her it was what I'd wanted to do from the start before everything got messed up. My parents sent out the revised guest list with a message about scaling back to a more intimate celebration. I saw the email because they copied me on it, and the wording was careful, like they were trying not to admit they'd screwed up the first time. My mom called me the next day, and I could hear the stress in her voice when she talked about what people were going to think. But then she said something that surprised me. She said Esmeralda had made the right choice, and she wasn't going to fight her on it. I overheard her on the phone with one of her friends later that week explaining the change, and she actually sounded proud of Esmeralda for knowing what she wanted. It was weird hearing my mom talk that way because usually she needed to control everything, but maybe Shirley's mediation was actually working. 4 days before the wedding, my dad called me, and for once it wasn't about logistics or vendor problems. He asked how my business was going, and when I started to give him a quick answer, he said no, he wanted to really understand what I did. So I explained how camera holdings worked, how I'd built up the vendor network, what kind of commercial projects I took on. He listened without interrupting, which might have been a first in our relationship. Then he admitted he'd never understood my work, and had made assumptions based on not knowing anything about the industry. He said he thought commercial filming was just making YouTube videos or shooting weddings for cheap. I told him about the Nike campaign and the Apple project, and he kept saying he had no idea, like he couldn't believe his son had actually built something successful. It wasn't a full apology, but it was the first real conversation we'd had about my career in 8 years. 2 days before the wedding, I woke up to a long email from my mom. I read it on my phone before I even got out of bed, and then I read it 2 more times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She wrote about how she and my dad had gotten caught up in trying to present a perfect family image and had lost sight of what actually mattered. She said they'd treated me like a problem to be managed instead of a son to be celebrated. She acknowledged that they'd been wrong about my career, and wrong to uninvite me and wrong to take my money without asking. She said she wanted to do better going forward, and she hoped I'd give them the chance to prove it. Something in my chest loosened when I read that, like a knot I'd been carrying for years finally started to come undone. The day before the wedding, we had the rehearsal at the garden venue, and it was beautiful. The space was intimate and personal in a way the giant ballroom never would have been. Flowers were already being set up, and the natural light coming through the trees made everything look soft and warm. My parents showed up looking nervous, but they were trying. I could see that. They didn't make any comments about the smaller scale or try to suggest changes. My dad actually helped Constantine figure out where everyone would stand during the ceremony. Then he made a joke about me knowing how to use all the forks at dinner, and for once it didn't feel mean. It felt more like he was trying to acknowledge how stupid his concerns had been. That evening, the immediate family went to dinner at this Italian place near the venue. Esmeralda looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in months, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Constantine kept thanking everyone for being flexible with the changes, and my parents kept saying it was Esmeralda's day, and they just wanted her to be happy. They were quieter than usual, not dominating the conversation like they normally did. My dad asked me about a project I was working on, and actually listened to my answer. My mom asked about my equipment and seemed genuinely interested when I explained the difference between the cameras I used. Nadia pulled me aside when I went to the bathroom and said Esmeralda had been so much happier since the wedding plans changed, that she'd been stressed and miserable before, but now she was actually excited about getting married. On the morning of the wedding, I got to the garden venue at 6 to set up my camera equipment. The sun was just starting to come up and the light was perfect, that soft golden color that makes everything look magical. I walked around checking angles and planning shots while Xavier's team finished the last details on the flowers and table settings. The venue looked stunning with all the natural light and greenery. Xavier showed up around 7 with coffee and made a joke about this being the most high-stakes shoot I'd ever done. I laughed, but he wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about capturing a wedding anymore. It was about showing my family what I was actually capable of doing. My parents showed up around 8:30, and my mom went straight to checking flower arrangements and table settings. She kept adjusting centerpieces by tiny amounts and asking Xavier's team if the chairs were spaced right, but her voice was different from usual, less commanding, and more like she needed something to do with her hands. My dad found Constantine in the groom's suite and spent 20 minutes helping him figure out his boutonniere, making jokes about how he'd worn his backwards at his own wedding. I filmed some of it through the window, not the polished shots I'd use in the official video, but the real moments that showed them actually trying to be normal. Constantine laughed at something my dad said, and my dad clapped him on the shoulder, and it looked like an actual conversation between two people instead of my dad performing for an audience. I kept the camera rolling when my mom straightened Constantine's tie and told him he looked handsome, and when she walked away, I saw her wipe her eyes quickly, like she didn't want anyone to notice. These little ordinary moments felt important somehow, like proof that we were all capable of being decent to each other when we stopped worrying about appearances. Esmeralda came out of the bridal suite around 9:15, and my mom lost it immediately. Tears were streaming down her face before Esmeralda even made it fully through the doorway, and she kept saying how beautiful her daughter looked while trying not to smudge her makeup. I got my camera up and captured my mom helping with the veil, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the fabric and tucked a strand of Esmeralda's hair back into place. There was something soft in that moment, something that made me think maybe underneath all the status anxiety and control issues, my mom actually did care about us in her own messed up way. Esmeralda caught my eye while my mom fussed with the veil and smiled at me. This genuine happy smile that reminded me of when we were kids. My dad appeared in the doorway and just stood there staring at Esmeralda for a long moment before he said, "She looked perfect." He saw me filming, and instead of making some comment about me working at my own sister's wedding, he just gave me this small nod. It wasn't approval exactly, more like acknowledgement that I was doing something real, and he could see it now. The ceremony started at 10, and it was perfect in how simple and personal it felt. 80 people filled the garden space without making it crowded, and everyone could actually see and hear everything that happened. I moved through the rows with my camera, capturing the way the morning light came through the trees and lit up Esmeralda's dress, the tears on Constantine's face when she walked down the aisle, the way both sets of parents were crying openly. This is what I do for work, filming people's important moments and making them look beautiful. But today felt different because these were my people and my family and my sister getting married. I got shots of Nadia fixing Esmeralda's train and wiping away her own tears, of Constantine's parents holding hands during the vows, of my dad reaching over to squeeze my mom's hand when Esmeralda said I do. Every frame mattered more than any Nike commercial I'd ever shot, because this was the day my family started actually seeing me as someone who mattered. The reception moved into the garden pavilion, and people ate and danced and celebrated while I kept filming. My dad stood up to give a toast around noon, and I almost put the camera down because I wasn't sure I wanted to record whatever he was about to say. But then he started talking about both his children and their accomplishments, using our actual names and describing our actual careers, and for the first time ever, he mentioned Camera Holdings by name. He said he was proud of Esmeralda for building her career in finance, and proud of me for building a successful production company, and that both his kids had chosen partners who supported their ambitions instead of trying to change them. It wasn't a full apology for everything that had happened, and he didn't acknowledge the wedding disaster or the years of dismissing my career, but it was progress. He was standing in front of 80 people and claiming me as his successful son instead of pretending I didn't exist, and that meant something. I kept filming even though my hands were shaking a little, and when he finished and everyone clapped, he looked right at me and raised his glass. Later in the evening, when things were winding down, Esmeralda grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the crowd. She told me she was grateful I hadn't given up on the wedding or on the family, that watching me set boundaries had taught her she could do the same thing. She said that's why she felt strong enough to scale back to the wedding she actually wanted instead of the show our parents were planning. We hugged, and I realized that maybe some good had come out of the whole mess after all. She'd found her voice and learned to say no to things that didn't serve her, and I'd learned that I didn't have to accept being treated like a child just because we were related. Both of us had grown up a little bit through this disaster. My mom approached me as the reception was ending and asked if we could talk privately. We walked away from the pavilion toward the garden path, and she told me she'd been thinking a lot about how they'd treated me over the years. She said she and my dad had been holding on to this outdated image of who I was, still seeing me as the awkward teenager from prom instead of the adult I'd become. She admitted it wasn't fair to me or to our relationship, and she wanted to start fresh with regular dinners where they actually listened instead of lectured. Her voice was quiet, and she kept looking at the ground instead of at me, like she was embarrassed to be saying all this out loud. I told her honestly that I was willing to try, but it would take time to rebuild trust. The uninvitation and the deposit situation weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern of dismissiveness that had been going on for 8 years. Every comment about getting a real job, every comparison to Esmeralda's CEO friends, every time they'd acted like my career was a hobby instead of a business, had built up into this wall between us. She nodded and said she understood, and that she and my dad were committed to doing the work through continued mediation sessions with Shirley. It wasn't a miracle reconciliation where everything suddenly became perfect, but it was a real starting point for building something better. The next week, I got a notification on my phone that money had been deposited into my business account. I checked and saw $2,500 with a note that said first installment of 24. My parents had made their first payment on the repayment plan without me having to remind them or send Brendan after them, and that felt significant. I forwarded the notification to Brendan, and he confirmed receipt and updated the promissory note in our files. Xavier saw the email chain and made a joke about requiring all family members to sign contracts before any future interactions, and honestly, it wasn't the worst idea I'd ever heard. Maybe having everything in writing would force everyone to be clear about expectations instead of making assumptions. 2 weeks after the wedding, I finished editing the video and drove to Esmeralda and Constantine's apartment to deliver it. They sat on their couch and watched the whole thing while I stood nervously by the door, and by the end they were both crying. Esmeralda said it was perfect, that I'd captured exactly what the day felt like, and made it beautiful without making it fake. She posted some clips on social media that weekend with a caption about how intimate weddings were, better than big productions, and a bunch of her CEO friends commented saying they wished they'd done something similar instead of the massive events they'd planned. Constantine sent me a long text thanking me for the video and for helping make the wedding happen at all. A month after the wedding, we had another family dinner, but this time it was at my studio so my parents could see my workspace properly. I gave them a tour of the equipment and the editing bays and the small soundstage we used for certain shoots, and they kept asking questions about how everything worked. Then I showed them some of my commercial work, including a Nike spot that was airing nationally on sports broadcasts. My dad kept saying you made this like he couldn't process that his son had created something being shown to millions of people. My mom asked detailed questions about the production process, how many people were on set, how long it took to shoot and edit, what the client approval process looked like. It was surreal to have them actually interested in my career after years of dismissing it as making little videos, but I tried to answer everything honestly and show them what my work actually involved. They stayed for 3 hours looking at different projects and asking questions, and when they left, my dad shook my hand and said he was impressed. It wasn't everything I'd wanted from them, but it was more than I'd had before. At that dinner, we set up my laptop on the table and connected with Shirley for our first follow-up session. She appeared on screen with her notepad and asked how everyone was managing with the agreements we'd made at the mediation. My parents sat stiffly at first, and my dad cleared his throat before admitting they were still getting used to seeing me as someone who runs a successful business instead of their kid who dropped out of film school. My mom added that it was hard to break old patterns, but they were making an effort to catch themselves when they started falling into dismissive comments. I told Shirley honestly that I was still working through years of feeling invisible to them, that the hurt didn't just disappear because we had some good conversations, but I could see they were trying, and that mattered. Shirley nodded and pulled up her calendar, scheduling monthly video check-ins for the next 6 months so we could track progress and address any backsliding before it became a bigger problem. After the call ended, my dad helped me clear the dinner plates without being asked, which felt like a small but significant shift. 2 weeks later, Esmeralda and Constantine got back from their honeymoon in Costa Rica and invited the whole family over to see their photos. They'd stayed at this amazing eco-resort right on the beach that they could actually afford because we'd scaled back the wedding so much. Esmeralda kept showing us pictures of the private bungalow and the zip-lining they did through the rainforest, and she looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. Constantine pulled up some messages on his phone from wedding guests, and Esmeralda read a few out loud about how people kept telling them it was the best wedding they'd been to because it felt so personal and real instead of like a corporate event. My parents sat on the couch listening, and my mom actually said she'd enjoyed the smaller wedding more than she expected because she got to have real conversations with people instead of just making small talk with a huge crowd. My dad nodded along, and I could tell they were finally accepting that cutting the guest list had been the right call, even if it wasn't what they'd originally wanted. 3 months after the wedding, I landed a huge contract with a luxury car brand to shoot their entire spring campaign. The budget was bigger than anything I'd done before, and I invited my parents to come watch one of the shoot days. They showed up at the downtown location where we'd closed off 2 blocks to film, and I could see their faces change as they watched me direct a crew of 15 people setting up lights and cameras and coordinating with the client's creative team. My dad stood off to the side, taking it all in, and when the brand's marketing director came over to discuss shot angles, my dad introduced himself and said he was my father. The director's face lit up, and she started talking about how impressed they were with my previous work and how competitive the bidding process had been for this campaign. My dad's expression shifted between pride and what looked like embarrassment, and I knew he was processing how wrong he'd been about my career all these years. After we wrapped for the day, my parents stayed and asked questions about the production schedule and the editing process, and my dad kept saying how professional everything was, like he couldn't quite believe this was really my work. At our latest family dinner a few weeks later, my parents brought a wrapped package and set it on the table in front of me. I opened it and found a framed photo from Esmeralda's wedding, one I'd taken during the reception showing all of us together, everyone smiling and relaxed. My mom's voice was quiet when she said they wanted to remember this as the turning point for our family, when we started being honest with each other instead of pretending everything was fine. She admitted there were still awkward moments when old patterns surfaced, times when my dad almost made a dismissive comment about my work, or when she caught herself trying to manage everyone's image. But we were building something more real than what we'd had before, something based on actual respect instead of assumptions and old hurts. The framed photo sat on my desk in the studio after that, a reminder that the respect I'd fought for was slowly becoming real, and for now, that was enough. That's where we'll end today's story. I'm really happy you stayed till the end, because it makes sharing these moments feel meaningful. I hope it added something good to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to keep hanging out here.